Good morning and
Wait,
good
hold on.
evening.
Give it a second, June. All right.
All right. Good morning and good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. I'm Jun Yang, the director of the Institute for Corporate Governance at Kelley School of Business, Indiana University. The ICG was founded in 2004, and its mission is to conduct and disseminate interdisciplinary high-quality research that advance our understanding of corporate governance theory, informs policy debates, and importantly, influences organizational practice. So the ICG has hosted a series of public lectures on the new challenges faced by corporate boards. So we thank the European Corporate Governance Institute, the ECGI, and more specifically, Marco and Elaine. And I use Ostrom Workshop for co-hosting the public lecture series. Scott Shackelford, Professor Scott, is going to be one of the speakers today. Given the importance of data and technology, we have a mini series in the public lecture series, which is data and technology. In last December, Professor Wei Jiang from Columbia University gave a lecture on corporate governance meets data and technology. The focus of her talk is the governance, how to use big data and new technology to do corporate governance research and change corporate governance practice. For today and the May lecture, we are focusing on data governance itself. So today's lecture is Who Owns Your Data? Is done by my colleagues at Indiana University, Dr. Angie, Raymond, and Professor Scott Shackelford. And in May, Justin Grace and Charlie Lewis from McKinsey is going to talk more in depth about cybersecurity. So for all our lectures, the videos, the slides, and also the write-up for Q&As will be emailed to you if you register for this event. So you don't need to worry about it. You will receive an email in about a week. Any questions, suggestions, please email us at icg@indiana.edu. So let me now introduce our speakers for today. First of all, Angie Raymond. Dr. Angie Raymond is the director of the program on data management and information governance at Ostrom Workshop. And she's an associate professor in the Department of Business Law and Ethics at Kelley School of Business, Indiana University. She's also an adjunct professor of law at Mara Law School, also at Indiana University. Angie has widely written in the areas of all the buzzwords these days: online dispute resolution, data governance, artificial intelligence governance, privacy, international finance, and commercial dispute resolution. If you need any expert in those areas, you know whom to talk to, I suppose, after today's talk. Angie works with the IEEE on AI procurement standards and the CORD project that include blockchain smart contracts, another two buzzwords, and several health data exchange systems. So this is our first speaker. And the second one is Angie's co-author, Professor Scott Shackelford. Professor Scott Shackelford serves on the faculty of Indiana University, Kelley School of Business. Scott is the Cybersecurity Risk Management Program Chair, along with being the executive director of the Ostrom Workshop. He's also affiliate scholar at very top institutions at both the Harvard Kennedy School's Byford Center for Science, International Affairs, and Stanford Center for Internet and Society, as well as senior fellow at the Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research. Professor Scheckelford is really prolific. He has more than 100 articles, 5 books, including a children's book, plus many book chapters, essays, and op-eds for diverse publications. Similarly, Professor Scheckelford's research has been covered by many outlets you're familiar with, including Politico, NPR, CNN, Forbes, Time, the Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times. Without further ado, Angie and Scott, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you so much, June, for that incredibly kind introduction. And it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I'm going to go ahead and pull up our slide deck. And we're going to tag team, as you could tell, this presentation. It's a very big topic, but one that speaks, I think, to both, Angie and I's research interests, and hopefully many of you as well who are kindly attending yet another Zoom webinar. We know, but we'll try to make it hopefully as fun and interesting as possible. Just a quick note on the Ostrom Workshop before we dive in with Angie's part of the presentation, focusing on data governance. Then we'll be pivoting to talk a little bit more about cybersecurity and internet governance as well. The Ostrom Workshop is, of course, founded by Eleanor Lynn Ostrom and Vincent Ostrom almost 50 years ago in 1973, and they founded it to be a hub for interdisciplinary work focused on vexing governance challenges. They were interested in municipal governance before they became, very focused on natural resource governance. And of course, their work on the commons came in the 80s and 90s, eventually leading to Lynn's Nobel in 2009, the first woman ever to win a Nobel Prize in economics. These days, we have 5 research programs at the workshop, along with several initiatives that aren't listed up there, including sustainable food systems and a new initiative on space governance. So we would welcome any of you who are interested in these topics as well, along with our more than 20 active working groups. Angie runs several of those herself. And there's a variety of upcoming events. Basically, the bottom line, we'll put a URL in the chat to ostromworkshop.indiana. You're welcome to join any of these listservs that might be of interest, including our biweekly newsletter, Polycentric Circles. And we're just thrilled to be co-sponsoring this important governance series with ICG and ECGI. So thank you so much again, June, for this great opportunity. And Angie, without further ado, over to you, and I'm happy to advance the deck as you like. So just let me know.
So data, obviously, why is this an issue? Why have we been asked to speak today? So next slide. So we've been asked, obviously, to speak in a series directed specifically to corporations. So chances are good you have a ton of data, and you might even have a data management plan, or you might have Tom. But everyone knows you want to make data-driven decisions. Next slide. So of course, this is, the buzzword of the time, data-driven decisions. We think of a data ecosystem. You have tons of data. You may have it in various places, or you may be fortunate to have it in a warehouse. But either way, what we're talking about is an analysis through the use of data, of course. But there are some fundamental questions that we need to talk about to enter into this conversation. Next slide, please. So the key questions for those of you making decisions is to be right up front and say it's not really usually about who owns the data. It's oftentimes really about who has control of the data, what responsibility goes with that control, and sometimes it's about who owns the data. Next slide, please. So data 101, for those of you who are the uninitiated. Next slide. We're, of course, talking about the data ecosystem. And this is one of the common slides that I frequently use. This is just the beginning of conversations about data brokers. And obviously, I use this slide in the context of privacy. Most individuals don't even realize how much data is gathered about them individually. And this data, quite frankly, gets hoovered up by data brokers and then is either aggregated or used or sold in various ways. And we can create a very accurate picture of you as a digital existence. Next slide, please. Of course, data is everywhere, and it's one of the things I like to remind people is that when we talk about data, we're not only talking about digital data, but we're oftentimes talking about data that exists in other places. And as hard as it to believe, there are still data sources that exist in paper form, but data is nonetheless everywhere. Your Netflix, your Hulu, your Fitbit. Just to mention a few, not to, of course, we'll talk, I think I'm going to use a Kroger example in a bit. And if you live somewhere close to me or somewhere in a tech-driven city, you probably have smart meters, online payment mechanisms, and all those systems generate data and cause this huge mass of a data ecosystem. Next slide, please. But really, sometimes it might be about who owns the data, because it actually is. If you own the data, you can do all kinds of things with it. You can sell it, you can license it, you can share it, you can limit its use. But I think it's really important that we also recognize that one of the things that from a corporate standpoint you need to think through is, my opinion is data governance, at least in this context, is really about creating rules to ensure data is in the form and place necessary for those who do the analytics to use the data with the software that you've decided to procure to produce information, and oftentimes that includes visualizations. So there's a lot of data, but do understand in many contexts, you don't own it, but it doesn't matter. So a simple thing occurred to me this morning. We were doing a particular roundtable conversation with some city managers, and we were talking specifically about smart meters, which I'm assuming a lot of you are familiar with. This, of course, oftentimes use real-time data, right? So it's water consumption, water use, and sometimes water leakage that occurs at a very specific time. Why does this matter? Well, if I had asked the individual who owns the data, chances are good the answer would be, I don't know, ask the lawyers. And they don't mean that in a flippant way. What they mean is what they want to do is use the data. And it doesn't actually matter if they've obtained the data through a license or a permission to use, or from an open environment where someone's posted data through an API. All of these things feed into the data ecosystem and allow you to make better decisions. But of course, if you own the data or the data set or the database, this places additional responsibility on you as well. Next slide, please. So of course there are federal laws, and if you want to go to what could have been the world's most boring webinar that Scott and I could have done, we could have gone through this alphabet soup. Now, none of this is meant to dissuade you, and I've intentionally left it as alphabet soup. Hipaa, glib, ECA, COPA. These things are all laws that govern certain types of data, siloed data. So for example, most people will be familiar, I would assume, with Hipaa. This is a data protection law that ensures that those individuals in the healthcare system, but only individuals directly within the healthcare system, have an obligation to protect your health data. So these laws are usually very narrow, and they're very much cover usually the specific type of data or the mechanism that is occurring in the shared environment, and don't go much beyond that. Okay, next slide, please. There are also now emerging state laws as well. And again, we want this to be a big, broad overview, so we don't want to go through these in particular detail. But one of the ones that I will point out to you is the Biometric Information Act from my home state, Illinois. Happy to talk to people about that in a broader conversations offline without this webinar occurring. But you do need to know that even state laws are now beginning to take on particular types of data gathering, and the biometric data is an example of that. And so it's not that in that instance, you can't say this is health data. You can't say it's just biometric data, which can include everything from fingerprints to facial scans, which is something that the Ostrom Workshop has worked with a lot of different institutions about this biometric data and creating an environment that includes privacy protections as well. Okay, next slide. But note, in general, these laws restrict the way you gather, use, share, aggregate, store, and retain the data. And oftentimes they actually do not care if you own it. This is really about you controlling it even for a moment in time. So focusing on ownership in the more traditional sense is really going to cause problems. From a corporate perspective, what you really need to talk about is, hold on, do we have a moment of control? Is it somehow in our possession that we are making decisions about the way we gather, use, share, aggregate, store, or retain the data? Are we making a decision? At that point in time, I would argue you have control, and you have liability that attaches with that control. Talking about ownership is important in some contexts, right? You probably have IP rights that you own. You might have entire databases that you own, and that gives you greater decision-making authority. But you should recognize there's probably a lot of data that comes into your zone of control that you don't necessarily own, and you still have liability that attaches at the point in time that you actually have control over this. Now, I'll tell you one of my favorite stories in this particular area. And I'm going to use my local existence. It's always nice to do that. So I'm going to use the Kroger app. Now, the Kroger app, for us, Kroger is a grocery store. I think it's a Midwest primarily grocery store, but they went tech savvy several years ago. When you first started using their app, It did exactly what you would assume, almost similar to the Amazon shopping environment. You log in, you add things to your cart. In theory, you purchase them and you walk out of Kroger with them. You can either have them gather it or they'll drop it in your car. Sometimes they'll deliver it. But that was a very basic functionality. The problem was about 2 years ago-ish, maybe a little sooner, Kroger decided to do some type of geofencing. And what would happen is if you put it in your basket, you would walk into the Kroger store and now the basket would be there, but it would disappear because now you're in the Kroger store and they assume you're going to use the Kroger app to help navigate the store. So what they did was literally kill my shopping list over and over and over because of the new functionality. But to Kroger's credit, they recognized that that was a failure. And I'm assuming I'm not the only one who before you would drive to Kroger, you would put your phone in airplane mode, which would allow your basket to remain visible. And so, but the key to this is to understand that Kroger then was able to adjust as well. And so now what you have is functionality in the Kroger app that you can actually create your own list that isn't designed in a basket form. And what actually happens is when you walk, as you're getting ready, I create a shopping list that isn't intended to be in a basket. My shopping list appears and it tells me where the items are. Aisle 3, aisle 7, this is just God's gift to us all, quite frankly, if you've ever shopped in one of these massive Kroger stores. Now, why am I so positive about the Kroger app? It seems like I must work for Kroger and I don't. Please understand what this also means. Kroger is gathering real-time data as to how we use the app. Kroger may or may not own that data. And from the perspective of Kroger's adjustments that they made, they don't care probably. What they want to do is gather real-time data of how that app is being used and make adjustments. So it's not about ownership. At the point in time that they're using that data of how we're interacting with the app and making adjustments or not, even something as simple as that data is within their control and they have responsibilities as it relates to it. And that's what, in my opinion, therefore, we really need to focus on in this particular area. Okay, next slide, please. But that doesn't mean you're excused from understanding the basics of where we're moving to. So AI strategies are a good place for us to begin to look. So next slide. So in 2018, Scott and I have written a paper on this along with some colleagues, which we're happy to share. If you're interested in it, it's a long paper. But here's 2018, and then next slide. Here's today. And you'll note 2020 in fairness. So what we're seeing is an emergence of more and more AI policies and strategies. There's a couple of things, though, to take away from this. The first thing, full disclosure, AI is a buzzword. Artificial intelligence is a buzzword. And I think it's officially becoming close to the time that we have to, as professionals, begin to reject the oversimplification and the use of AI as a buzzword. We really need to start drilling in and start actually talking about what technology it is we're talking about. I'll use the IEEE example. And for those of you who are on these calls, you'll remember walking down memory lane. IEEE decided to do an AI procurement working group, which is right now existing. And I virtually walked into the first meeting. I said, what is AI? And everyone realized we had to come up with a definition because AI procurement working group was about ready to lump any technology under AI. And what that meant was you were going to overregulate most likely, right? There's tons of technology driven, really simple automation that happens that we probably don't need to regulate at the same level as AI that's actually capable of doing real-time sensing and actually producing decisions. And so we probably need to stop using this buzzword. And when that happens, you'll see shifts in this again as well. Next slide. So these are the key themes that emerge. And the question for corporations is, who cares, right? Why do I care about key themes? Well, my argument would be, and I think Scott would agree, these key themes, although they're not yet necessarily embedded in law, are showing us the direction that if law were to be developed, they will probably move into. So when you're talking about international human rights, human values, professional responsibility, even though these sound like buzzword or buzz phrases, they are key themes that are emerging. And it's important that you keep an eye on this because our belief is that you'll start seeing these produced and replicated in law. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, these are the different AI governance efforts that are ongoing right now, but all of these are going to, next slide, are going to focus on lofty notions. Here you have ethical frameworks, you have AI principles, you have ethics for artificial intelligence. It doesn't matter which of these you look at, they're going to focus on lofty notions of trustworthiness, accountability, fairness, depending on which of these you look at. That's not bad. It's a great first start. But of course, these are going to have to begin to move from lofty ideals into rules that are capable of allowing business to comply with the law. And I think Scott and I both see that as the next stage. It's why we point out these goals to you. And even though they sound like lofty notions of what the AI should be, I would argue that at some point in time, probably very soon, we'll begin to see the operationalization of those. What does accountability actually mean in this environment? And then businesses are going to have to respond and produce compliance mechanisms that ensure that you're living up to those laws. So even though right now we're still sort of in the buzzword phase of accountable, responsible, transparent, I don't think Scott does either. I don't think it'll take long until we start seeing these lofty notions operationalized into local tech deployments. And when that occurs, you're going to have to adjust and produce compliance frameworks that match the new law that's come out. Next slide, please. So again, you're going to see these are several different initiatives, and it's just an example of moving through these various buzz phrases. But what I think you will see is they all share some commonalities. So these are not just completely disparate. Everyone has different AI principles. We are starting to see that these principles are starting to look similar or maybe the same across various entities, cultures, and of course, across our global community. Next slide, please. And that leads me perfectly into this idea of, if we're going to talk about, things that have already been operationalized, in many ways, when we talk about transparency, accountability, and security, of course, what we're talking about is what Scott Shackelford is well versed in discussing in our current example, cybersecurity. Scott, to you.
Thank you so much, Angie. That was an incredibly helpful foundation that you just laid. There's a lot to hit on here. So again, we'll just be hitting just on a few highlights as we move. As Angie was saying, though, there are many sides to this coin of governing data. And what do we mean? And I think what Angie was saying about being clear with the definitions for some of these key terms like AI is so important, but also challenging, right? We are seeing some convergence with regards to AI governance, at least at the level of these national strategies, which again, can be quite amorphous, as Angie was pointing out. But it's important to note that even more fundamental terms, like what the heck do we mean by cyberspace, are still all over the map, which does make it challenging for domestic policymakers to think through where do we head? And for, of course, corporations under their jurisdiction to operationalize some of these concepts too. This is a quick chart from Cisco showing how even countries you think would share a fair amount in common, as well as some leading international institutions, are all over the map with how they define cyberspace, right? Is it an extension of national territory, which kind of goes along with our theme today of who owns your data? If it goes along with it being an extension of national territory, that's part and parcel of this notion of cyber sovereignty. And ultimately, it's the government, right, that owns your data, as opposed to potentially corporations that gather it, which is often the case, as Angie was describing here in the States, versus putting you in the driver's seat first and foremost, and not only knowing about who has your data, but actually controlling it, which is, of course, much more common in Europe under GDPR. And before that, since the Data Privacy Directive, which we can talk more about as well. But it's important just to note that bifurcation, because that is driving a lot of the global developments we're seeing on the policy front, which, of course, has enormous implications for corporate governance as these businesses have to navigate this really complex regulatory landscape. So just note that there is a difference of opinion on a lot of levels here, including among academics. There's a lot of international lawyers who not only think of cyberspace potentially as an extension of national territory or as a global commons, right? Which means that at some level, all of us as stakeholders, including corporations, have a role in regulating it. And others argue that it's something in between, right? An imperfect commons or a pseudo commons, which is how Joe Nye described it a few years ago. So it's important just to think through that and those implications just a little bit. They play out on so many levels, from the 5G debates involving Huawei and at a lot of other levels beyond that, right? This is animating a lot of the discussions that we're seeing, looking ahead to the next major internet governance gathering in Russia in 2025, where they're going to be pushing for the UN and the International Telecommunication Union to move in this direction of cyber sovereignty, right? The world is not this black and white, as a lot of you are aware, but it is important just to note that there are, two trends emerging here, both online and offline, right? This rise of authoritarianism, right? Of digital protectionism, data localization. It has a lot of manifestations, but that's at the root of this question, really, of who owns your data. We haven't settled on that, globally. As Angie was pointing out, we haven't even settled on that in the US, really, right? It often depends on what kind of data it is, under what circumstances was it gathered, and frankly, these days, what state do you live in? Even here in Indiana, there's a bill pending in the Indiana General Assembly right now that would move us in the direction of Colorado and Virginia and actually give residents a lot more protections in the way that we've seen in California and other states. So it's very much an emerging topic. This is one last quick note as far as global context. Again, 10 years ago, I wanted to throw this up there just to show you that 10 years ago, the countries in red were those countries that signed up to this multi-stakeholder internet freedom agenda, which was more or less the status quo for a long time. So in other words, these are the countries that would recognize the human right of privacy, of data, to varying degrees. The countries in black were those at this particular UN conference I decided, what? We would like to head in the direction of nations having a larger say in this notion of cyber sovereignty, in the direction that we head. As is clear, again, it's not this black and white. This was a resolution attached to an international telecommunication regulations decision. It should have been a yawn fest, but this made it interesting. And it did bring to the fore, especially during the second term of the Obama administration, the importance of building consensus on internet governance, which they did in Brazil and in South Korea and New York in the years following. But now we're back to this core question of where should we head as a global community as we think about the next generation of these internet laws. Focusing on cybersecurity in particular for just a moment. Again, this is just one aspect, as Angie was pointing out, of this incredibly challenging topic, but one that, of course, corporations are incredibly interested in, because they're not only under regulatory requirements to get it right, increasingly, though, they're also under the looking glass of nations, because there's so many national security implications of all this. Cyber attacks themselves are nothing new. They've been around for decades at this point. I'm actually working on a book right now on the history of cybersecurity, which has been a lot of fun. Mostly, though, we look back to the late 80s as the time when this really came to the fore as an issue area of concern, starting with something called the Morris worm. This guy, Roger Morris, was a grad student at Cornell at the time and infected MIT's network with what became one of the first worms, not the first, but one of the first. Caused a lot of damage. Roger was prosecuted under the then very recent Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which criminalizes unauthorized access of systems. It's worthwhile to note that law has been copied all around the world since the 80s. Don't feel too sorry for Roger, though. He's now a professor at MIT and a dot-com millionaire. So things did not work out too poorly for the world's first cyber attacker. What's different these days, though, is how quickly these attacks have proliferated in numbers, sophistication, and severity, and the fact that they're targeting companies and countries alike. And the issue is only becoming more complex because of what we call the expanding attack surface, right? So there's this notion of the Internet of Things, this idea, as Angie was pointing out, from smart meters, smart cities, smart workout clothes, you name it these days. All of those open up tremendous business opportunities. Consumers love them. It's kind of fun when you pull into your garage to have the lights in your house come on. But a lot of those systems weren't designed with security in mind. So there's a tremendous technical debt that's already out there that we have to figure out how to deal with, and what should the responsibility of corporations and governments be as we deal and spend down that debt over time, and also put into place regulations going forward to ensure that we're on a more positive trajectory. That's one of the big mega trends that's out there. Another one is, of course, the geopolitics of all this. the geopolitical implications in particular of critical infrastructure attacks. As you saw on the last slide, that's playing out here closer to home. You might remember of the attacks on Colonial Pipeline, the ransomware attacks just about a year ago now, which got a lot of attention because basically that company had to more or less shut down its operating systems in the aftermath of that breach. And they wound up, you might recall, actually paying a ransom. And very publicly, the CEO went before Congress and said, I did it because I thought it was in the nation's national security, the national interest, and that it was the ethical thing to do, which is a really interesting question. Is it ever ethical to do that, right? Because you're, of course, incentivizing the attackers to keep doing it. But when you're in situations such as, a natural gas pipeline, the administrator of a hospital where people's lives are actually at stake, you can see why they make the decisions that they do, right? So it's putting companies very much in the crosshairs, as we see now, again, with what's happening in Ukraine, as I'll turn to in just a few minutes here before we close. I wanted to give you just a few insights, though, for how some of these trends are playing out closer to home. So we did this report with the Indiana Business Research Center and Kelley for the Governor's Council on Cybersecurity back in 2020, and we surveyed hundreds of companies across the state. And it's a classic good news, bad news tell for how they're doing with regards to cybersecurity governance and best practices. The good news, if you can call it good news, is that the word has gotten out. So 95% of the organizations said they were somewhat or very concerned about cybersecurity. And there were some benefits with being named a critical infrastructure organization, which we can talk more about if folks are curious too. You see a little less prevalence there of being breached if you're in one of those fields. And we've seen 90+% of these respondents taking some proactive steps to protect themselves, to protect their companies, right? But there was a lot of confusion about where to put that next dollar of investment to ward off these breaches, okay? And in terms of what the breaches are, even feed into that confusion. As you see here, ransomware, quite common. We're planning to redo this study, I should say, post-pandemic, ideally. We'll see if we get there, right? But later this year to see how these trends have changed. But phishing, wire fraud, malware, very common. And you see here, so some of the steps taken in response. An interesting one is the purchase of insurance. This has gotten a lot more challenging during the pandemic just because of how expensive these policies have been getting. It's not only, property insurance policies, but even cyber risk insurance policies themselves are having double-digit gains. And for some, including some nonprofits, they're being priced out. As one quick example, I'm on the board of directors of the Hoosier Hills Food Bank here in Bloomington. And we were dropped. We didn't actually have a breach, but we were dropped just because of this particular insurance provider not wanting to insure NGOs anymore. Basically, they don't have the deep pockets to help in these ransomware attacks in particular. So that's a problem because this is one of these key risk mitigation tools that are out there. And this is one of these key findings as well of why don't we invest more? Just that aspect of being unsure where to put that next dollar of investment, right? Do you put it in an insurance policy? Do you put it in a cyber hygiene training program for your employees? Multi-factor authentication, end-to-end encryption, or leveraging AI, as Angie was talking about. So I think that's where we in academia have an important role to play, right? To distill down some of these best practices and get it out there so that especially small and medium-sized businesses can have a better view of what that low-hanging fruit is. And some of that good news is happening in part thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So a lot of local governments in particular and small businesses are going to be qualifying for grants to roll out new funding to help in this. That's only one piece of the puzzle. There's, again, we could talk about any one of these for the remainder of our time, so I will just skate over them. But it's important to be mindful of everything we need to do to manage cyber risk really from the ground up here. So as corporations are thinking about this, thinking about supply chain security, first and foremost these days, incredibly important. There's some new tools, as Angie was saying, including blockchain that's being deployed by a number of companies like Walmart, IBM, you name it. It's not a panacea. There, like any software, it can be hacked, and there's been demonstrations of that, but it can be a piece of the puzzle here. Protocols that we all rely on, whether we like it or not, including the domain name system, which is what gets you to indiana.edu and not, God forbid, purdue.edu. That's built by a nonprofit and managed by a nonprofit in Southern California called the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. So this is a nonprofit under the jurisdiction of the California Attorney General's office, responsible for the global domain name system, right? That starts to get to those core questions of internet governance and global policymaking here. Liability structures, really important. Who's liable for a breach, right? I'll give a slide in just a moment to kind of show you the menu of options that are out there. But there's a lot of jurisdictions, including France, which is considering extending its products liability law to include internet connected devices. So you wouldn't have to prove negligence, in other words. If there's a breach and it can be traced back to a smart speaker manufactured in France, strict liability would apply, right? Which wouldn't change for sure incentive structures, probably boost security, but then there's really legitimate questions then about, of course, the impact on cost, the classic, pace of innovation, et cetera. So it's important for businesses, bottom line, to be proactive, to build in cybersecurity best practices from the start, not bolt them on after that fact. And that comes down to corporate governance as well. One of the reasons Equifax here in the States got into so much trouble and has basically become a case study in what not to do following a data breach is because their corporate governance structures were terribly aligned for cybersecurity. They had their chief legal counsel actually responsible in part for deploying patches on these systems, right? There was a complete lack of communication between the people who needed to know, right? Their incident response plan was outdated. They didn't have any connection point for who was going to be liaising with law enforcement. And the slow bleed of information that resulted from all that is just a testament, frankly, for what can happen, because in that case, my goodness, the vast majority of everybody's credit reports living in the US were breached just in one episode there. That's only one piece of the puzzle. Technology can help, as Angie was saying. Some states like Illinois are experimenting with regulating and incentivizing things like biometrics, but organization is a key piece there. We're never going to get rid of this cyber threat, though, as you see here from this quote from Jim Clapper. But the idea is to manage it more effectively, the same way we do by managing so many other risks that we face. There's a lot of experimentation for how we do that. One thing businesses are trying, particularly in the finance sector, is just throw a ton of money at the problem and hope some of it's well spent, right? And of course, the reason that that's happening is because that's where the buck stops. If you get a fraudulent charge on your credit card, you don't pay for it, the bank does, right? And that's one reason the bank has, and our finance industry generally, has invested so much in cybersecurity and has pulled together resources from so many different entities. There's now a joint security operations center managed by the financial services ISAC, it's called Information Sharing and Analysis Center. So they pooled their security resources together in a way we haven't seen across other sectors. And I'd argue that's primarily a result of that liability structure. Do we want to replicate that in other sectors beyond finance and healthcare to a degree? Another thing that's being tried out, which was a core theme for the ICG series this last fall, and I think we're going to return to, June, going forward, is this idea of ESG, right? Could we utilize the tools from sustainable development and the green movement to think through all the different risk profiles here on basically natural ecosystems and digital ecosystems that these companies are touching? There's this notion of ESG plus T, right? Of thinking through how do we leverage sustainability reporting to include technology. One quick example of that is Eli Lilly up in Indianapolis, a major pharmaceuticals company. They now include information on data privacy and cybersecurity as part of their integrated sustainability report for things like insulin pumps, because they're interested on the overall impacts of their products on consumers, on broader supply chains, on this digital ecosystem. And other firms are heading that direction. Angie and I are actually working on a paper now as well about not only informing investors about some of these initiatives in ESG plus T, but also consumers through things like labeling, right? Could we create something like an Energy Star label or a CE label in Europe that would meaningfully convey information to consumers about the cybersecurity, the data governance practices of a given product? And we've seen a lot of experimentation with that in Europe, in Singapore, and increasingly in the US. For boards of directors as well, there's a lot of great resources out there. Brad Wheeler, who's also a professor here at the Kelley School, gave a great overview of these cyber principles for boards from the NACD this last fall. And perhaps we could put a link in the chat for anybody interested to go through these in much greater detail. But you can see up here just some of the basics. The main thing is to be proactive. One of the reasons that boards really get into trouble is they're not thinking about cybersecurity on a continuous basis. Maybe there's one report a year. Maybe it's being, shunted off to a committee, right? Maybe there's not a direct reporting chain back to the CEO, back to the board, to senior leadership. The more that you can do to engage on a continuous basis, the more likely you're going to fulfill your fiduciary duties, to your organizations, and organizations are going to be much better prepared for an eventual breach. And this is just some of the ways to go about doing that. And then in terms of the kind of regulatory aspects here in the US, globally, and we'll wind up in just a couple minutes, you see here a smorgasbord of approaches that are being tried at the federal level, as Angie was saying earlier, at the state level as well. At the federal level, we have something called the Federal Trade Commission, which is the closest thing we have to a comprehensive cybersecurity regulator, like the European Commission, for example. They're responsible for regulating, among other things, unfair and deceptive trade practices, which has been applied to cybersecurity in the wake of major data breaches, including, Facebook, Equifax, you name it. They've been under pressure from courts, especially over the last 5 years, to be more specific by what do they mean by best-in-class cybersecurity best practices for these companies under their settlement orders. And this is what they came up with. So in other words, this is kind of a David Letterman style top 10 list. This does not mean that if you check all these boxes and you have a breach, the FTC won't come knocking, but it does make it less likely. That's what they're trying to show with this. Of course, it's a moving target, but it's important just to keep this data point in mind. There's also a lot of efforts underway to use standards, right? Standards, including from the National Institute for Standards and Technology, which has a cybersecurity framework, a privacy framework, a supply chain security framework in the mix, which we see being replicated around the world to varying degrees to protect, among other things, critical infrastructure. I put this slide in there just to remind ourselves of how broad this topic is. There's a lot under this heading. Right. In the US, there's 16 critical infrastructure sectors, everything from healthcare to finance to public facilities, right? Water utilities. The vast majority of our economy has been deemed critical, but it's important to note that all of these companies managing things like the grid, there's more than 3,200 companies alone that are managing the grid in the US, they're in private hands, but they're performing a public duty to keep the lights on. Right? So it's a really interesting public-private question there. How far should governments be able to go to protect this infrastructure, to protect the underlying data? How far should, private companies be able to make these decisions on their own? And for that matter, what role should the military have when there's issues like foreign nation states attacking this critical infrastructure? Right? We haven't gone to the difficult next step yet of figuring out what's the most critical of critical infrastructure. We have these 16 sectors. We don't have a ranking scale, right? Other countries do, including China, which is interesting and we can talk more about. It's tougher to do in democracies, though, to say you're more important than you and we're going to give you more resources. In the EU, of course, there's a lot underway. I wish we had more time to talk about it. For critical infrastructure, the Network Information Security Directive, the NIST directive, is really the go-to, and it does a lot, including establishing national competent authorities for reporting lines. So if you're a company based in Europe, let's say in France, it's clear who you report to in France. And then there's an international cooperation group to spread this information so that we have a much better view of overall cyber risk trend lines in Europe, thanks to the NIST directive and thanks to GDPR, right? We're only getting there in the US because we're, frankly, no surprise, much more fractured with 50 different state level data breach notification laws. There's a lot in GDPR, of course, that pertains here. We don't have time to go through it all. Happy to take questions, which I see are already percolating in the chat there. And then, of course, we see other ways, right, of who owns your data. In the EU, of course, you own your data, and there's a lot of ways that is manifest, from the right to be forgotten to data portability, et cetera. In China, much bigger push, which we see now in the news this week with the Olympics coming up. I did a number of interviews just yesterday as we think about, this mandatory Olympics app that everybody has to download and what are some of the vulnerabilities there. There's a lot of requirements on companies operating in China with regards to data, including, of course, data localization, which we can talk more about. But this kind of goes back to who owns your data for China and for an increasing number of countries participating in the Belt and Road Initiative and this kind of broader digital Silk Road idea. It's not just, of course, the Chinese government, but governments increasingly are coming around to this notion and pushing back against this idea of a global network commons, which has, of course, business, human rights, a lot of implications there. We did a study a few years ago to look at all of these national cybersecurity strategies, the same way that Angie and I looked at national AI strategies. And you see here a lot of agreement that protecting critical infrastructure, protecting these companies is incredibly important, but not a lot of agreement on how we go about doing that. Just 20%, for example, of these countries were talking about the need for new laws and regulations. What else is being tried here in the US? One thing that we're beginning with is to adapt what we've had for some time, right? That's a classic go-to. Look at analogies. One notion is this National Transportation Safety Board, which is an interdisciplinary body that investigates transit, right? Disasters, maybe a train derailment, a airline accident, right? They go in, they figure out what went wrong. Was it a governance failure? Was it a vendor? Was it a hardware malfunction? Was it all the above in the case of some of these more complex issues? And they issue an authoritative report that usually is taken up by industry as industry norms and sometimes even codified by Congress. Could we do something like that for cybersecurity so we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel here? The Biden administration this last year put out an executive order to establish a cyber safety review board to help these companies and investigate what happened, the likes of, Log4, for example, to make sure it doesn't happen again. We've been calling for exactly that for some time. And the plan is that the membership for this board is finally going to be announced next month. So watch this space. And there's a lot of other implications here that we can talk more about, including this notion of Internet of Things that we brought up earlier and how that pertains to broader efforts globally. And we'll end up with this global note here because I think that might be helpful. We've been trying to be at the forefront of thinking ahead here, right? Thinking ahead of the technological, the regulatory trends to see more broadly where we're headed. And admittedly, a lot of this is aspirational in the same way that the UN Sustainable Development Goals is really aspirational, right? But it's important to think through not just cyber war, conflict, but to flip the paradigm, right? And to think about we as a global community, right? Whether you're an executive at a company, an academic, just a user, like you all are right now, right, of the internet. What's the best we can hope for in terms of peace on the internet and how might we be able to get there? Not a lot of work has been done on this over the years. Some of the early stuff was actually thanks to the Vatican and the World Federation of Scientists, which likens cyber peace to this universal order of cyberspace built on a wholesale state of tranquility. It sounds lovely. Of course, is not going to happen anytime soon, as we see, right? So we're interested in more practically what can be done if we're not going to end cyber attacks, as we saw with that quote from Jim Clapper, which could be kind of a negative cyber piece. How can we build a more positive future? I'm happy to report just last year, we took some giant strides and as an international community in that direction, including by agreeing to these 11 cyber norms, which are basically rules of the road to guide state behavior in cyberspace. These were originally discussed a number of years ago, but last year, thanks to several UN working groups, they're now signed off on by the vast majority of UN member states. And you note number 7 there, right? Protecting critical infrastructure is on the list. The tricky part now is operationalizing this, as Angie was saying. What do we mean by that? What are the requirements, the verification mechanisms, the attribution mechanisms, and what do we mean by this core idea of due diligence, including on companies, right? Because again, a lot of this is in private hands. That's where the discussions are going now. But the fact that we at least have some consensus on these core norms is important and an important step in the right direction. This is a very large effort that's been building toward these norms for some time now. These are just some of the groups involved. We have our first ever edited volume on the topic of cyber peace coming out through Cambridge University Press just next month, which includes a lot of the authors and institutions that you see on the screen. It's going to be available under Cambridge's open access program. So happy to provide a link. We'll be highlighting it in the Ostrom series as well once it's out. And then lastly, this is where we're headed, at least aspirationally where we'd like to head. This came from a virtual Davos summit that we co-hosted last year, which adapted the sustainable development goals to data governance and to cybersecurity. This is just the product of brainstorming from that session, and we would love your thoughts, your reactions to this type of a list. Again, aspirational, but again, if these are goals that we can at least get behind, we can start pushing in the same direction and hopefully make some meaningful progress towards cyber peace. So just lastly, these are some of the research questions. Jun asked us to kind of think through, what's kind of interesting for us looking ahead. These are some of the projects that are in early phases of development that I'm involved with in particular, and some of the key questions I'd love to see others tackle as well, including what do we mean by reasonable security, right? How can we better leverage this ESG frameworks that have gotten so much attention and funding to do a better job at managing technology, supply chain risks, and broader data governance challenges, right? What about tax? I'm doing my first tax article now, looking at different tax incentive structures here. Can we tax cyber insecurity? Can we reward cybersecurity, including R&D tax credits in various ways? And a lot of jurisdictions are experimenting with that. The first one was Virginia just last year here in the States. And then lastly, how do we think about regime effectiveness, right? So a lot of good questions that I think need to be answered, and a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done, and would love to partner with any of you in that journey. So Jun, just thank you so much again for this opportunity. It's been such a pleasure, and we'd love to take as many questions as we have time for. Oh, I think you might be muted, Jun. I'm sorry.
All right, thanks for giving us a wonderful talk. I've learned tremendously, even though I feel like I want to learn more. So there are some questions in the Q&A session. Angie and Scott, would you want to pick up some? And then for the rest, we're going to write up answers. Just leave me 2 minutes towards the end to conclude. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Oh, for
Absolutely.
sure. Angie, would you like to take the first one from Simon about data trusts? And
yeah, so I was gonna, so a couple of these we should answer just really quickly to be sure that we're sending you in the right direction, which is back to us. So one of the things we're very actively working on is data trust and the context of a data commons, of course. Data trust, data hubs, data cooperatives, fill in the blank. But for those of the uninitiated, what you're really talking about is data sharing that's shared in sort of a centralized place, and working together as a collaborative community into what goes into it, what comes out of it, how is it managed, how is it structured. You see these oftentimes in particular types of data. So you might have health data in a particular state, for example. I will tell you, so this is actually oftentimes when data is actually property, and it's why I say ownership might matter. So these become sort of a shared ownership by the community. And I'm assuming it's coming up because you recognize we're from the Ostrom Workshop. And of course, that draws upon Ostrom's IAD principles and others to talk about bounded and ways of restricting access and things like that. So that's incredibly quick, because what I'm going to tell you is we have a working group who's actually doing this and talking about it. And of course, we do tons of work with various people around the globe, quite honestly. So Simon, if you're someone who we don't already know, please do reach out. I'll be sure you have an email address. So Scott actually touched on a couple of points from a couple of these questions. So I think it's probably better if we do a more, I'm assuming it's asking us to dig a little deeper, and we're quasi on touched on time. But I do think one of the questions that might be interesting based on what you were just talking about was, what are some of the things a multinational business can do to operate in this complex regulatory environment? And I'm going to throw that to you because you're the polycentric person much more than I am, Scott.
Oh, no. Yeah, no, thanks, Angie. And I'm looking at Roland's questions and to an extent, Stephen's. Yeah. So I think hopefully
we will answer these. So we will answer these. We're just trying to manage time well here. So yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, and you're right. And the classic lawyer answer, of course, is it depends, right? As Angie was saying, it depends on the type of data, depends on the jurisdiction and the context in terms of who owns it. There are those three fundamental options that are out there, right? In terms of, at the end of the day, ownership. But one of the things that and to clarify, corporations, basically you, right, ultimately as the user at the end of the day, or governments at the end of the day. And the classic example, of course, being China, which has the classic idea to think about property rights, right, is, like a toolbox, right? So many tools, so many things you can do with a property right, but in some cases, the government still holds one of those tools, right? Kind of a magic tool of exclusion. And that's true in real property as well as, digital common property in this case. And I mentioned common property because one of the things that the Ostrom Workshop has been known for, and one of the things that's got me interested over the years in it, is because it's not, private or public, right? There are so many levels of common property, of communal property, of data trusts, as Angie was talking about, each with their own benefits and drawbacks, depending on the type of issue area, depending on the end goal, right, as we were talking about toward the end of the presentation, right? And there's a lot of interesting analytical tools that we're trying to bring to bear to answer some of those. As Angie was saying, the institutional analysis and development framework is one of them, right? The Ostrom design principles from Lynn's book back in 1990, Governing the Commons, which led to the Nobel Prize and kind of lays out some governance best practices for managing common pool resources, including data, right? Governing knowledge commons itself, which is an outgrowth of the IAD framework. And as Angie was saying, polycentricity can also help us here because ultimately this is a really multi-stakeholder environment, right? We have companies, we have countries, we have civil society groups, right? We have academia to an extent, all involved, throughout the history of internet governance. It's been messy, but it's been the way it's worked. And I'd argue the only way we can really think about that is this notion of, polycentricity, this idea of how can we get multiple levels of authority working together around a similar topic and pushing in the same direction. And we don't have time right now to go in all the findings. There's a polycentricity working group that's actually based, there's co-conveners, but one of the key ones is in Germany. Everyone's welcome to join that. Just check out the Ostrom Workshop page. But one of the key findings in that literature is if you don't have communication first, you can't get to coordination and you can't get to trust, right? So without that first step, these systems can quickly fragment, right? And lead to gridlock, lead to a lot of consternation. And we're seeing some of the results of that, frankly, I argue, playing out before our eyes now. So they're great core questions, and would love to keep engaging with all of you as we all likewise attempt to understand and answer them.
Jun, I think we should turn it back to you. You asked for a couple minutes at the end, and I think again, first of all, I think, and Scott should jump into, very much thank you. We see these questions, we will respond to them. That is something that is an expectation of this. So don't worry, we will get to each and every one of these, and we'll be sure that you have those answers as well. And again, thank you for having us.
Thanks a lot. Again, Scott and Angie, I've read your slides multiple times. I'm trying to summarize. I feel like it is so broad. It's also so deep. It's very challenging for me to summarize in a meaningful way. So essentially, I put the questions you raised here and to use it as a starting point, perhaps, for the two of you, and perhaps some audience of this webinar who can think deeper about, actually, just around us every day, you will face such challenges. For example, tech companies headquartered in China, when they are listed in the US, now the US regulators ask them to store the data in the US, while the Chinese regulators do not allow them to do so at all. So that caused many delisting decisions for these tech companies. And also, when you're working with co-authors, for example, if you use China data or Indian data, or data from European countries, what you can have, what you cannot have cross borders, probably you want to be super careful, especially in China when the laws are changing rapidly. When we started this series, because we collaborate with the ECGI, so I work with the lawyer at Kelley School of Business as well as the legal counsel at Indiana University. What I learned is if I got any data from the ECGI, any names, anything from the ECGI, from Mark or Elaine, then I have to go through 21 hours training to do it. I say, okay, good. I'm not getting any data from them, but they are marking our events. They are doing all the things together with us. So that's kind of the awareness everybody want to have. And hopefully going forward, there are going to be more models and more papers, research ideas that can help us further our understanding of this important issue. And I think the key is what Scott and Angie mentioned. I think this is, in the end, a risk management problem. So how much is the cost? How much is the benefit? Where is the balance? What's the equilibrium? I think that's probably the ultimate question going forward. Keep in mind, we have another talk on data and technology in May. So coming up, there's a mini series on institutional investors. So there are two of them. One is in March, that's on hedge funds. So these are active investors. And this is a review of the literature. What's the practice now? What's the most hotly debated questions? And the second one is about mutual funds. These are indexers or so-called passive investors. They're not passive at all. So the speakers are Alan Brough from Duke University and Todd Gormley from Washington University in St. Louis. These are all experts in the area, so you are more than welcome to join. Again, any questions, any comments, please email us at icg@indiana.edu. Thank you again. Thanks for attending our webinar series. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Angie, for giving us a wonderful lecture. And we hope to see you soon in March. Thanks. And that marks the end of today's event. Thank you and bye. All right, bye.
Thanks a lot, Jun. That was a lot of fun.
Thank you. All the materials will be emailed to everyone in about a week. Thank you.
Okay. That sounds
Bye.
great.